podcasts.
The Profile. You're listening to Premier Christian Radio.
Well, good afternoon and welcome along to the programme. I'm Justin Brierley, and today on The Profile, I'm speaking to Richard Harries, former Bishop of Oxford. He was that title for 19 years, now a life peer in the House of Lords. And we're going to be hearing about his life journey, his story, his latest book, The Beauty and the Horror, as well. And The Profile is brought to you in association with Premier Christianity magazine. If you'd like to get a free sample copy of the latest edition, do go to their website at premierchristianity.com/free sample. And don't forget, you can find The Profile as a podcast as well, increasingly popular as a podcast online. So do check that out and check out past episodes of The Profile at our website, premierchristianradio.com/The Profile. Richard, welcome along to the programme.
Thank you, Justin.
It's great to have you here. As I understand it, you didn't really grow up in a Christian household particularly, so tell us about the sort of formation, as it were, of your Christian life as things got going for you.
Well, I was never sent to Sunday school. We never went to church as children. I mean, later in life, my parents came into the church in a very big way, but I can remember my mother saying she couldn't get my father into church even on Christmas Day for 20 years. So there wasn't any church there. The one time we went to church, and I remember this very vividly because apparently there was meant to be an outstanding preacher at a local village, so my parents thought, well, they'd go along, take me along. And I remember thinking to myself, I can still feel the feeling, total ham, I said to myself, total ham, absolutely unconvincing. So I was starting from that.
Yes.
I went through the rigmarole of being confirmed at school, and it did mean something to me. I tried to take it seriously in a sort of rather schoolboyish kind of way.
But ultimately, it was an experience a little later on that really kind of brought you to that place, I understand, where you sort of asked yourself the question, is this really true, I suppose?
Yes, I mean, it was, I suppose, when it was about 18, a thought came into my mind, well, if Christianity is true, it must be at the centre of my life. If it's untrue, it can't be at the periphery, give it up altogether. So I started to look into the faith, reading books, gravitated to certain friends who had a Christian faith, and it gradually took hold of me.
What did your parents make of all this, meanwhile?
Well, at that stage, they really didn't know very much about it. It was only later on, when I suddenly decided that I was being called to ordination, that they became horrified. Later on, they came hugely supportive later on,
And entered the church themselves, as far as I understand.
Yes, exactly.
Yes.
My father became a church warden and all that kind of thing.
What was the catalyst for their change of mind themselves in that sense on faith?
Well, I think my mother had always had a rudimentary faith, which never had a proper way of kind of expressing it. I think my father in middle age must have gone through some kind of midlife crisis, because I can remember when he was away in Singapore, he started to lose weight, started to read people like Uspensky and Gurdjieff, who are great sort of figures at some stage. He started to look around into that kind of world. And then I noticed, he started to gravitate to Christian literature and started going to, I don't know what there was, but he'd obviously went on a journey. Yes. Yeah. And there's some words of T.S. Eliot, which he pinched all the best lines, of course, from the wonderful 13th, 14th century mystical work, The Cloud of Unknowing. And he quotes them at the end of the four quartets. The drawing of this love and the voice of this calling. The drawing of this love and the voice of this calling. That was my experience. Something took hold of me. Something drew me. Something called me. And then that calling became very real all of a sudden. Not just to live and to believe and live as a Christian, but I was in the library one day and looking for the usual Hardy novel or something, and by accident or providence or whatever, I picked up a book of essays by Roman Catholic priests entitled Why I Was Ordained. Don't ask me why. And I read it with interest and I put it down. I remember thinking to myself, well, wouldn't it be funny if one day I was ordained? And every few months that come back. Wouldn't it be funny if one day I was ordained? Now, I was just about to go up to Cambridge on the army to read science, serving out in Germany just before I was due to go up. And the thought came into my mind, well, when I retired from the army as a successful general with a nice fat army pension, wouldn't it be wonderful to end my days as a country parson? I'm not joking.
You had a sort of romantic vision of that lifestyle.
And then immediately, slap bang, came into my mind the thought, well, if you're meant to be doing it, you better do it now. I'm not joking. And it totally exploded inside me. So I could do no other. I wrote to the Queen asking her to let me go. I went up to Cambridge, and the college which was going to have me to read science refused to have me to read theology because they didn't do it. So I simply wrote round to all the colleges saying, can anybody have mercy on me? I want to come up and read some theology. Went up on no money. Selwyn kindly offered me a place and went up and read theology. But I could only have done that because, this extraordinary strong feeling which literally precipitated me.
It was almost
it was volcanic.
From beyond yourself, this feeling.
Well, wherever it came from. Well, it was obviously within me. It was a volcanic explosion within me. My parents were absolutely horrified. They thought they got me launched and somebody else was paying for me to go to university.
Right, they thought you had a very nice career in the army, then into science. They got me off their hands and everything. Right.
Yeah.
Gosh.
So
this was a big diversion from the plan.
It was very, and of course, I've been so blessed. It's been such a wonderful life.
Yes, absolutely. And wherever this thought came from, if this stuff is true, if Christianity is true, then I'd better take it seriously. Obviously, lots of people do coast through life with maybe a sort of glancing familiarity with Christianity, church, Easter, Christmas, births, funerals. Never quite, though, really deciding on whether this stuff is true or not. But as I think C.S. Lewis famously said, either it's the most important thing in the world, or it's not important at all. What it can't be is moderately important. And I suppose you sort of had that experience.
I did have that feeling. I did feel, if it's true, it must be at the centre of my life because it is so important, so crucial.
And at what point did the person of Jesus Christ, in that sense, become a real thing to you from being a sort of, I suppose, somewhat half thought about reality to a living reality?
Well, my understanding of God has always been a God which has been shaped and formed by Jesus Christ. There's no doubt about that. But I think that the person of Jesus has become more important to me over the years. I think that's all I can say. But my view of God, right from the word go, was fundamentally Jesus Christ, and the incarnation again. But I came to believe in the incarnation in a funny kind of way. It was not reading a Christian book. I nearly hadn't read the kind of Bible at all. I was reading Aldous Huxley's The Perennial Philosophy. I can still remember in a great barrack room in Germany built under Hitler's time, and I was in my room and reading Aldous Huxley's Perennial Philosophy, the idea that at the heart of all religions is the idea of giving yourself and to find yourself. I remember thinking, I said, well, if that's what's at the heart of every religion, what is a better example than the God of Jesus Christ, who gives himself to create the world, who gives himself in Jesus Christ.
The penny dropped in
so
that.
The penny dropped. Well, this is what the incarnation is about. Yes. One of those sort of light bulb moments.
Right. Yes. I mean, you've already given away that you have had a love affair with literature your whole life, really, and your latest book, The Beauty and the Horror, as well as many others you've written, draw on all kinds of poets and writers and playwrights and so on to draw out the meaning of life. Yes. Has that just been something that's naturally been there? You've been naturally a bookish sort of a person? Yeah, I've been naturally,
but my parents were abroad a lot and left me in this country a lot, and I picked up books, if you're in that position. In those days, there was no television.
But you weren't a sort of go out and play football type.
Oh, yes, I've loved sport. Oh, yes, I've always loved sport. Yes, very, very keen on sport. But I've always enjoyed books right from the word go. I've picked up books and read books. One of my most extraordinary memories is I always, at the school I was at, the housemaster used to come round the dormitory every night to see what boys were up to. He used to come and knock on my door and open up. And he used to see me in bed reading a novel. And his words still ring in my mind, my boy, why aren't you working? But the short answer is I always went to bed early and read novels.
That's funny, isn't it? I mean, what? Obviously, a lot of these strike you very deeply because when I've spoken to you before this programme, you seem to be able to draw on quotes and pieces of literature at will. So it's almost as though some of these...
Yes, it's a fault, actually. It's I wish it a fault. I mean, the trouble is my mind tends to leap from quotation to quotation. I try to get out of the habit. It's very, very difficult.
But it's great in a sense that you really see the world in a sense as being described by people in books, in literature. People are making sense of the world.
People are making sense of the world, and you're entering into other people's lives and expanding your own sympathies, entering into people's lives.
That's the beauty of literature, isn't it? That you can, as it were, live other lives.
Yes, exactly.
By engaging with it. You're opened up to a whole new world.
Yeah.
And in that sense, how has the Bible how have you engaged with the Bible?
Again, I think the Bible has meant more and more to me over the years. I think particularly recent years, you can get periods where you go away from it and you read other things, and then you come back and find it all again fresh. But again, the Bible is absolutely fundamental. As I say, I think it means more to me now than it ever has done in the past.
When it comes to the great novelists and writers, if you could sort of choose maybe two or three who have most powerfully spoken to you in ways that not only illuminated the world but your Christian faith, and they may not be typically thought of as quote-unquote Christian writers, who would you land on? Well,
I think inevitably Dostoevsky, his novels, Crime and Punishment, for example, but particularly the Brothers Karamazov, where the great issues of suffering and evil and love and faith are debated in the profoundest way possible. So that would be my number one choice. The book which probably had the biggest influence on my faith, it's T.S. Eliot's The Four Quartets, which I could go back to.
For those who aren't familiar with T.S. Eliot, just describe who they were and what
their T.S. Eliot was the great poet. I mean, it was the best-known poet of the avant-garde in the 1920s, and he spoke for a disillusioned generation in his great poem, The Wasteland, regarded very often as the greatest poem of the 20th century, completely broke all the canons of poetry, a modernist poem of modernism, and he spoke for that whole constituency. And then suddenly, to a shocked world, he announced in 1927 that he now described himself as a classicist in literature, a royalist in politics, and an Anglo-Catholic in religion. And he'd been baptized secretly the year before, and baptized and confirmed secretly. The church doors were locked, so he didn't want anybody. But it shocked and horrified all his friends. Here he was, the leader of the avant-garde, the agnostic, atheistic avant-garde, for whom religion meant absolutely nothing, and they were all absolutely appalled. He started writing poetry from a Christian point of view. Then his first Christian poem, Ash Wednesday, Song of Simeon. Today is February the 1st, the Feast of Candlemas, about Simeon. Lord, now lettest thou thy servant depart in peace. He wrote a poem about that, and it's read every Sunday in so many any Christmas in so many churches. His poem, The Journey of the Magi. But at the end of the 1930s, 1940s, he wrote his masterpiece, The Four Quartets, which is an amazing work. I can go back to time and again.
Obviously, something for people to pick up if they've not done so. It sounds as though you've been on this journey then, discovering the world and Christianity with the help of certain authors and literature. You had this epiphany almost where you felt this calling to be a priest yourself. Yeah. How did that manifest itself initially in terms of the first sorts of ministry that you were involved in?
Well, the odd thing is that, not the odd thing, but I had what I imagine when I offered myself for ordination, I had a very, very simple vision of what I'd be doing, which would be knocking on the houses in northern cities, bringing them solace and comfort. I don't know. I sort of imagined a grey, dreary day, sort of raining, and miserable people in the sun. Me looking, bringing them some
sunshine.
some hope. Extraordinary, really, that I should. But anyway, that's.
I had no slightly naive view of what
I had no
meant,
experience of the church. You see,
course.
I'd never met a member of a church.
No.
I mean, we had school chapel, and I went to church when I was in the regimental level. It's not I never had no experience of parish life. Of course, I wouldn't be recommended for ordination. Now, that's the extraordinary thing. I've been nowhere near it.
That's interesting, isn't it?
Now they want people,
with a bit more experience and everything.
Yes,
sure.
Yes.
Well, that's interesting in itself. That in a sense you've been formed on the journey as a priest and so on. I mean, when it comes, you obviously have this very academic side to you, though, and you wanted to express that presumably.
Well,
as well
I know, but I basically have always seen myself fundamentally as a parish priest. I've got diverted into other things, but I went to Cambridge. I read theology, then I went to Cuddesdon Theological College, and did some more study there, and then I went to Hampstead Parish Church, and had 6 gloriously happy years there. I was married then, and we had a couple of children, and that was a wonderful life. And I did university chaplaincy as well. That was one, and this was in the swinging 60s. That was an extraordinary time.
Of course,
people don't realise quite what the 60s was like. I mean, I was the professor of maths at Westfield College, where I was chaplain, went off to man the barricades in France, in Paris. It was an extraordinary time.
Social upheaval.
We thought that the world was going to change. We were all deeply involved in Christian Marxist dialogue and all that sort of thing. So I had 6 beautifully happy years there, and then all I wanted then was to run a parish of my own somewhere in London, and nothing was actually available at the time that I wanted. I knew it's the one time in life I knew exactly what I wanted. I wanted a kind of middle city, mixed socially parish. I didn't want an inner city eclectic parish, and I didn't want a church, with due respect to Woking, with in E.M. Forster's words, worship the great suburban Jehovah. I knew what I wanted, a middle city London parish which was socially mixed, and there simply wasn't anything available. So after 6 years I had to move on. I saw an advertisement for somebody to teach philosophy of religion and ethics at Wales Theological College. So I applied for that and I was appointed, and that was wonderful because you're lecturing week in, week out, sets a foundation for everything else that one does. And then the dear Bishop of London remembered what I wanted. He wrote to me and said, "Dear Richard, I think I've got what you wanted, what you wanted those years ago, and that is to be Vicar of All Saints Fulham," which was precisely what I wanted. So I had 9 very hard years there, sort of in my early 30s, when you've got plenty of energy, ambition, but you've got a bit of wisdom, socially mixed parish, and, wonderful opportunities for sort of building up the congregation. And
but you since then, and there's so much to cover here, that you've been in all kinds of different positions. You were the Dean of King's College London for a period in the 1980s, I think it was, and you went on to obviously become the Bishop of Oxford then thereafter. And so was that a sort of just a natural progression, or was this all very much a surprise to you?
Everything has been a surprise. As I say, the only job I ever wanted was that first job, and eventually it came my way after a bit of waiting and being distracted. Fundamentally, wonderfully diverted, because it's been so fundamental to me. Yeah. But no, I'd done 9 years at Fulham, which was quite a tough job. Actually, it's a good, difficult job being a parish priest.
Absolutely,
actually, And then I was asked to apply for. I didn't want to move, but I was asked by 4 or 5 people to apply for the job of Dean of Kings, and then suddenly I'd been there about 7 years, and a letter dropped through the door. Opened in. It was from Margaret Thatcher saying, "Would you allow your name to go forward to be Bishop of Oxford?" I didn't even know that the diocese was vacant. I didn't follow ecclesiastical practice. It came totally out of the blue.
I suppose that sort of it meant a whole new learning curve for you as you entered that type of a role with all its responsibilities.
Well, I found it. I have to say, I found it very natural.
Right.
I didn't find it difficult, frankly.
Okay.
Diocese of Oxford, wonderful diocese, lots of very, very good people,
Yes.
able to afford better resources than a lot of dioceses. I appointed good fortune to appoint some wonderful people as area bishops, because it's a vast diocese, and I had 3 area bishops.
Sure.
Split into areas. It was a wonderful, and it was near enough London to be able to do things in the House of Lords and to do. I
mean, Oxford. I was there as an undergraduate myself, and the town itself has a number of thriving churches, obviously,
yes, absolutely.
Both within the evangelical sort of side of things and in the Anglo-Catholic side of things, and so on. So it's quite a there's everything for everyone in terms of the Anglican representation. And broadly speaking, have you tended to see yourself as more in the sort of Anglo-Catholic tradition over an evangelical sort of perspective or a liberal perspective?
I'd say that it was what I would call the Catholic form of Christianity that took hold of me. I've always had evangelical friends, but I think it was the Catholic form of Christianity which drew me.
What about that specifically? The more
the sacramental side. The Eucharist, the Holy Communion, has always been absolutely fundamental, absolutely fundamental to me, to my devotional life. I suppose the depth and the richness of the whole Christian faith in its totality. And not just a kind of exclusive focus upon the cross and conversion as a result of the cross. I'm very drawn by Eastern Christianity and always have been, with its emphasis upon theosis or divinization. As the great fathers used to say, God became human that humans might become divine. Which is a very biblical doctrine if one looks at Colossians and Ephesians and so on. But it's sadly neglected in Western Christianity. So that whole idea of Christ coming and dwelling with us and us dwelling in Christ so that, we're changed into his likeness as he dwells within us.
And you feel that's lacking to some extent in a more evangelical kind of
Well, I haven't it may be there, but it's not placarded.
Yes,
It's not placarded. So
it strikes me that you're very. I mean, I've done this very program with Rowan Williams in the past, and he's said very similar things. In fact, I think he almost was persuaded at one point early in his life to become to enter the Eastern Orthodox Church, because he was so drawn to that, the ritual, the liturgy, the mystical side, really, of that's emphasised there. But you've obviously stayed the course in the Anglican Church.
Yes, I think anybody in my position, you ask yourself whether you should remain who is drawn to the Catholic form of Christianity, whether you shouldn't really be a Roman Catholic. Right. So I'm hugely drawn by the internationalism of the Roman Catholicism, of its sort of steady, being a person who likes things to be tidy and organised. I like the discipline of the Roman Catholic Church, but in the end, I cannot, go along with some of the things which are taught as essential to the faith. The usual reason.
Right.
And I'm hugely drawn to Orthodox Christianity. But as Austin Farrer used to say, he too was, but he's not a Slav or a Greek, and he felt
it is quite a culturally manifested.
It's very cultural, and it's very unfortunate. It's very nationalistic. But yes, there's.
I mean, we're obviously skipping a lot of ground here, but obviously in later years, you've obviously, having retired from that position as Bishop of Oxford, became Lord Harries of Pentragarth. That's the official title as a peer in the House of Lords. What sort of duties are involved when you're appointed to that kind of a position?
Well, there's no duties at all. You turn up if you want to. I mean, it's voluntary. Totally voluntary. I mean, I've been trying to do sort of 3 afternoons a week in the House of Lords. I'm actually cutting down now to 2. You follow the issues you're concerned about as well as the main bills. I'm particularly focused on a certain number of human rights issues, which are the ones that matter to me. One of them is the Dalits, the former untouchables in India. Who are terribly badly treated still, of course, across all those South Asian countries. So I follow those issues as well as the sort of main. I mean, moment we've got the European Union withdrawal bill in the House of Lords, and we were late there, very very night seeing that through.
Do you enjoy the being in the centre in that sense of political life?
Yeah, I wouldn't overrate it. But I mean, it's all right. It's not the heart of me,
no.
but it is a way where some sides of me can get expression.
I mean, obviously, you were presumably attended the House of Lords quite regularly as a bishop as well.
Yes, I did. I did. The reason, I think the only reason I was made a life peer was that actually I was active as a bishop, the most active of the bishops, and I did do a certain number of things.
You'd get on with it.
I chaired I chaired the select committee on embryo research, for example. I've done one or two pretty key things there as a bishop. So that was the reason.
Well, it would be fun to just dwell on some of those issues in the next section of the programme before we also talk about the beauty and the horror. That's the latest book that Richard Harries, my guest on the profile today, has written. I'm Justin Brierley, and the profile brought to you, as always, in association with Premier Christianity magazine. If you'd like to read more interviews with Christians in all walks of life, do get a free sample copy of the latest edition, premierchristianity.com/free sample. And I'll be back with my guest, Richard Harries, in the next part of today's show, The Profile. There's a knife crime epidemic in our capital city. In the February edition of Premier Christianity magazine, meet the inspiring Christians bringing God to the gang leaders in the battle for London. Plus, Kay Warren talks about how her marriage to megachurch leader Rick Warren nearly hit rock bottom and what brought them back again. Sam Hales asks whether evangelicalism can survive in the age of Trump. Where's Sutton on what to do when God doesn't heal? And the amazing account of how Corrie ten Boom's unshakable courage saw thousands of Jews rescued in World War II. All that plus much more. Ask for your free copy at premierchristianity.com/free sample.
The Profile. You're listening to Premier Christian Radio.
Welcome back to the second half of today's Profile programme. I'm Justin Brierley, and you can find The Profile online at premierchristianradio.com/The Profile. Lots of other episodes. You can download the podcast there. And indeed, you can find more interviews in our magazine as well, the monthly magazine, Premier Christianity Magazine. Ask for a free sample copy at premierchristianity.com/free sample. Richard Harries is my guest today on The Profile. He's former Bishop of Oxford. He's a life peer in the House of Lords. He's an author. He's a media broadcaster as well. And we were talking just at the end of that last section, Richard, about the fact that you've had this role in the House of Lords for some time and sat on some important committees as well, looking at issues like fertilisation, embryology. I mean, you're then mixing, obviously, with scientists. These are issues you've got a real interest in. Do people sort of tend to assume because you're coming to things as a Christian, you've kind of got a vested interest of sorts in how you're going to approach those kinds of issues? And is that ever an issue when you're kind of involved in that kind of stuff?
I don't think it was an issue as far as my appointment to chair the Select Committee on Human Embryology was concerned. I think I was appointed because I made a speech on the subject in the House of Lords where I tried to point out that the Christian tradition about the moral status of the early embryo was not quite what the Roman Catholic Church thought it was. It was much more nuanced than that, and I suppose that must have impressed people that I would take a more open position. I wouldn't take a hard line position, nor would I take a very open position. I tried to look at the evidence.
We don't have time to go into all of it, but what broadly were the issues that you were trying to come to grips with?
At that stage, there was the question of getting stem cells from embryos. Whether we can get cells from any part of the human body, but if you get cells from embryos, then this means the destruction of the embryo.
And stem cell research is it's all about these cells that can produce any kind of
certainly part. That stage is very, very important. It's a very, very kind of burning issue there.
Yeah.
So that raises the question of what is the moral status of the early
and can we, as it were, produce embryos for the purpose of effectively harvesting
when
them?
When should we talk about a human person?
Indeed.
Well, I was convinced theologically that actually the 14-day limit, which is the one we have in law, is actually an appropriate point, because that's the beginning of the nervous system, the point beyond which you get no more divisions into anything else. Before that, you have this bundle of multiplying cells, but after about 14 days, or the what's called the emergence of the primitive streak, the beginning of the nervous system, you have something which is individualized.
Yes.
And
that must have put you to some extent at odds with Christians and specifically Roman Catholics, I imagine.
Yeah, well, there were actually two Roman Catholic members of my committee. One extremely distinguished philosopher. No, sorry, we had a distinguished philosopher, but no, there was two practicing Roman Catholics, but they felt they could go along with this.
Right. I mean, obviously, these are all decisions that sort of, affect not just, these aren't just ivory tower ethical issues. These are real world issues. As far as I understand it, the medical stuff has moved on a bit now. That I think there's now technology enabling stem cells to be produced without necessarily having to use embryology and so on. Yeah. But this is all part of your varied and interesting career as in terms of what you've been involved in, and part of that has also been doing radio shows, not dissimilar to this, but the BBC particularly, you've been a regular contributor to Thought for the Day and so on. There's been a long-running sort of debate over Thought for the Day, hasn't there, on the BBC as to whether it should be opened up to other people of no faith, humanists and so on, and whether it's wrong to simply have people who are religious on. What's your thinking on that, as someone who's obviously contributed many a time?
Yes, well, I've been doing it regularly since about 1972, believe
Probably
it.
one of the longest contributors.
By a long way. Yeah, exactly. I think it's that slot, although it is sniped at a lot by media people.
Even John Humphrey sometimes.
They groan about it. But in fact, when a poll was commissioned amongst Radio 4 listeners, it turned out to be the most popular of all the items, above sport, for example, of that. So, it has... I know a lot of people hate it, but actually people as a whole, listeners to the Today programme, do like it. I mean, it's a wonderfly privileged slot to have, because we have a very big audience, but it's a very, very difficult slot to do.
Yes.
And of course, we now have Buddhists, Hindus and so on.
That's obviously changed within your time.
That has certainly changed. When I first started doing the BBC, it was totally
it was exclusively Christian.
Totally different.
How? I mean, in as much as it's opened itself out in that way, do you welcome that, or do you find that that's sort of diluted what can really be achieved through it?
I think it reflects that we are in a pluralist society, and I think that is right. There's still a good body of Christian contributors to it, which is.
And what about the atheists and humanists who say we want a piece of the pie as well? Why should it just be religious types who get that airtime?
I think we need to understand what Thought for the Day is. I do not see it as a way of simply plugging one's own religion. I think that's not at all what it's all about. It's meant to be a thought for the day, which is derived from a particular perspective on the universe. If there is an atheist who has a perspective on the universe which is derived from a serious moral tradition, whatever it might be, Aristotelianism or whatever. I myself don't see anything wrong in that, but of course at the moment it's BBC policy not to do it. And that is
the way it is at present.
Policy. I think the important thing is you've got a perspective which actually really does illuminate life.
Yes.
A serious moral or religious tradition.
Indeed. Let's turn to your book, The Beauty and the Horror, and it really is summed up in that title, because you're both reflecting in this book on the joy that we find in the world through art, literature, transcendent moments of experience and family life, culture, and yet at the same time we're faced with unspeakable horror and suffering, both brought on us by our own free actions, but also just in a sense part of the nature of the world that we live in, where the volcanoes that refresh the surface of the earth with necessary minerals are also the cause of destruction for people who live in their vicinity and so on. I mean, people have been asking this question ever since the Book of Job, really, haven't they?
Yeah, absolutely.
Why did God allow this sort of a world to be the one we live in? If you were trying to encapsulate what you're trying to put across in this book, where would you begin?
Well, I would begin by saying that when God decided to create the world, he said, "Let there be." He gave the world and all the forces within it a genuine autonomy, a genuine freedom. That is what it is to be created. To be created is to have a life of one's own, whether it's an amoeba, a mosquito, or whether it's you or me. And this autonomy comes to self-conscious freedom in us human beings. And of course, if we are genuinely free, we're free to make mistakes as well as to make good decisions. Mistakes cost lives, and certainly manifestly evil choices are ghastly and destructive. So, we cannot have free choice without the possibility of evil. Now, that's all, if you like, fairly obvious. I think a more sophisticated point is that we can't have rational beings like you and me without a certain stability and regularity in the environment. If I was suddenly to float up through the ceiling or drop through the floor, and we lived in an Alice in Wonderland world, so I didn't know whether the sun would rise tomorrow or not, we wouldn't be able to plan. We would therefore not be able to make rational decisions. Mind as we know it would not have evolved. And so it looks as though for there to be people like you and me and all human beings, there has to be a kind of impersonality about nature, everything doing its own
and that
thing.
Will inevitably
mean that unfortunately it brings suffering and destruction. Because there's nothing wrong with, as we know, with volcanoes and earthquakes in themselves. They're simply the shifting of tectonic plates on a star which is cooled enough to allow life, but is not so cooled that it won't have life. If it was any hotter or any colder, there wouldn't be life. It's because there's a plate on it we can have life, but this sort of plate which covers over the molten stuff inside allows for...
So it's sort of the cost, if you like, of being embodied conscious creatures is at the cost of obviously the again, fragility of that life.
Now I think all this makes sense. In other words, there couldn't be people like you and me without... I can't see any other way of creating rational beings except for something like this. But it still raises the question, and this is the overpowering question at the heart of the book, was God justified in creating the world, if this was the cost of it? And this is Ivan Karamazov's question in the heart of the book, The Brothers Karamazov, where he tells horrific stories of the suffering of children, and then he turns to his brother Alyosha and says, "It's not God I don't believe in, Alyosha, it's just that I return him the ticket." It's this moral protest against God. Now, the implication of Ivan Karamazov's question is that it would have been better if God had not created the world in the first place. And that, for me, raises the question as to whether I'm grateful that I'm alive. Are other people grateful that they're alive? Now, I can only answer that question for myself. I'm grateful that I'm alive. And I quote in the book a wonderful poem of W.H. Auden where he talks about raising his first fist in anger and despair and shouting against the sky. And then he keeps hearing the words, "Bless what there is for being." And I bless God for my being, but I can't answer that question for anybody else. Other people have to answer that for themselves.
Indeed. And I suppose ultimately the question that many, I suppose, an atheist is asking is, couldn't God have achieved this purpose of free human creatures with a bit less suffering, with a bit less gratuitous almost, suffering that does seem to exist in the world? Admittedly, if God stepped in every time people did wrong things, we wouldn't be able to have any consistency in life. But did the Holocaust really have to happen in order for... I mean, and without... It's hard to do this without sort of giving people a sort of cold, logical, rational sort of approach to God. So it's always going to be a difficult question to answer, isn't it?
A terribly difficult question to answer. And the short answer, all we can say is it looks as though it has to be a universe something like this. And as you already implied, if God kept on intervening to ensure that the bomb went off to explode Hitler, if he kept on intervening, it would be such a higgledy-piggledy world because everything has implications. If I'm driving along the road and a child runs across and there's a miracle so that I come to a vicious halt so the child is saved. But what about the car behind me, the car behind that?
Sure.
Does one? This is doesn't mean to say that God doesn't, in inverted commas, intervene, or there's not something called miracle. But it seems to me there has to be a limit if we're going to have the kind of character of the world.
I mean, one obvious way in which you do believe God has intervened in the world is in the person of Jesus Christ.
Yes, I do.
And to some extent, that is the ultimate answer you give, I suppose, to someone like the brothers Karamazov, in terms of how you can hold on to faith in a good God, despite the great suffering that exists.
Yes, absolutely central to my book is Jesus and the outlandish claim that there's not only a wise and loving power behind this universe, but this wise and loving power has taken human form and disclosed his heart and mind to us in Jesus Christ, that Jesus Christ was raised from the dead. His purpose is to unite our lives with his life for eternity and to reconcile all things to him. I mean, this is an extraordinarily bold claim, which I can quite understand why most people find totally
and one which you don't particularly seek to kind of provide masses of evidence for. It's more something that you believe there is some objective evidence if you look for it in the claims of Jesus Christ, but it's something for you that you have to want at some level in order to grasp hold of.
Well, for me, the resurrection of Christ is crucial. I have actually written a little book many years ago about the resurrection of Christ, as to why, I think that the story of the discovery of the early tomb is an authentic part of the early tradition. I myself believe that the tomb was empty, and that the disciples did have an overpowering experience of the risen Christ. Not, of course, a resuscitated body, but raised to a new form, a new kind of life. I mean, that's not the sort of thing that you can give any proof for. Of course, you can't, and there's always Hume's arguments, that it's much more likely that people were deluded. And there's always that kind of argument. But that ignores the fact that it's set against the background of all the Hebrew scriptures and the Christian belief, and indeed the Jewish belief, that God has wanted to disclose his purpose from a Christian point of view, first of all in the communal life of the ordered community life of the people of Israel, but then this coming to a focus in Jesus himself. It's against that background,
indeed,
that the resurrection and against the background of Jesus' proclamation that in his person and in the miracles that he did, this is the breaking into this world of the kingdom of God, and that he's in that kingdom in relation to one whom he called Father. It's only against that background you can see that the resurrection, it kind of fits in. You can't prove it, but you can see how it.
And to the person suffering in the here and now, in what sense do you believe Jesus Christ, a person who lived 2,000 years ago, was died and allegedly resurrected, as far as you're concerned? How does that relate to someone suffering in the here and now? Well, I mean, if one is ministering to somebody in the here and now, I mean, all you can do is be alongside them, accompany them, and try to some extent to share their distress and their pain, and be with them, and in that way you are also, as it were, living out the presence of Christ in and through you to be with them. That I believe that Christ is with them as well. And one tries to make this sort of, as it were, sacramental presence through one's own presence. It's no good for most people talking about, giving sort of religious consolations, and certainly nothing worse than kind of trite words, Job's comforters in that, in those. God has a plan. That sort of thing is absolutely awful for people, I think. But sometimes it is right to pray
with people, or people ask for prayer. Now that can be perfectly proper, even sometimes with non-believers. It's that's not an easy consolation, but it is something which can be done sensitively.
Have you sort of had moments where prayer seems to have really made a difference to someone who has been in that kind of a situation, or has...
It's difficult to say when anything's been intense, and I don't do a lot of personal ministry at the moment. I'm not in parish ministry, but I did go down to see somebody who was certainly a non-believer, an atheist, who I was working very closely with a particular project through the House of Lords, and they very much, just as towards the end, they very much valued that I was there and saying a prayer.
In terms of the ultimate hope we have, that's also where you land, I think, in terms of the way we make sense of suffering. To some extent, I've always felt that from an atheistic worldview, well, getting rid of God may sort of help to solve a sort of theological conundrum, but it still leaves us with the fact of suffering, and really that there is no rhyme or reason to it. It's somewhat meaningless. Atheists often accuse Christians who sort of defer the resolution of all this to some eternal hope in the future as, well, that's just your wishful pie-in-the-sky thinking. That's a handy get-out-of-jail card. Why isn't it that for you? Why should we genuinely consider the fact that in the fullness of time, God will make sense of all the suffering and pain that we do experience?
Well, I think it's a fundamental of the faith, first of all, the faith of the church, and I don't see how one can have a Christian faith without it. It really puzzles me, the number of people who claim to be Christian believers who actually don't believe in the afterlife.
Wow.
And of course it really puzzles me, and also with the number of liberal Jews, who I find that very, very, very puzzling. For me, it is one of the great pillars. There are a number of absolute pillars of the faith without which the whole thing comes tumbling down. The incarnation of Jesus Christ, the resurrection of Jesus Christ, and the hope of everlasting life. These are three absolutely fundamental pillars, and they belong. The thing belongs together as a whole.
Yes.
If you pull one out, the whole thing comes tumbling down. And for me, it's not that I want to survive afterwards. I mean, I don't think in those sort of terms. It is about the justice of God. We believe that God is a just judge, and that his justice will in the end be vindicated. His just and good purpose will in the end come through. And it clearly does not come through in the world as we have it in the moment. So it is absolutely fundamental to any kind of belief in a just and good God that there must be some ultimate reconciliation and resolution of.
Do you think for those who can't find it in themselves, or for whatever reason have not come to that point of being able to believe in that kind of a future certainty, who may think of themselves essentially as non-religious, atheistic, indeed, in Western culture generally, that's the direction most people are going. They say, I'm not religious when they tick the census and so on. Do you still think there is, though, some spark of people need that kind of meaning, that ultimate sort of reason, if you like, somewhere in the background, even if they don't maybe acknowledge it in Christianity per se?
I'm always wary of speaking for other people. People have to speak for themselves, and a lot of people today actually are coming to terms with death in a much easier way than was perhaps possible in the past. They find meaning in their lives. They accept that death is part of life, and they don't bother themselves too much about these big questions. But we are in a very, very kind of secular society, which is in contrast to the rest of the world. Most of the world, as we know, takes religion seriously. It is just Western Europe and the sort of east and west coast of the United States, really, where what Schleiermacher called the culture despisers have sort of pushed it off the scene. So I mean, all I can say is I think that this particular secular period in human history in certain parts of the world, I'd be very surprised if it lasted.
That's interesting. I mean, ultimately, do you find that whether people say they're religious or not, they ultimately do have some kind of a belief, in as much as most people may not go to church, but they'll talk about the power of love or the
yes. I mean,
search
people,
for truth.
Yes. Well, if we call that religion, yes, of course. I mean, lots and lots of people don't believe in God, but certainly believe in the power of love, and they love their families, they love their children, they love their friends, they want to do a good job. They're perhaps also very good neighbours. There's lots of things they believe in. There arises the question, of course, where they're going to ultimately get their moral values and standards from. It's interesting that Seamus Heaney, before he died, said once that he thinks that our society is now running on an unconscious of religion, but he wasn't convinced that his grandchildren would have that. I mean, if we take away the religious roots of the moral perspective which has so much shaped Western society and Western culture and our laws, if we take that away, is there any kind of comparably strong and rich tradition which will sustain that kind of moral vision of life? I pose it simply as a question. It can't be taken for granted that there will be.
And in as much as we perhaps are losing the sort of distinctives of that Christianity has given us in society, do you fear for whether people will have anything to undergird their character, virtue, their morality, and so on?
Well, in the end, what really matters, of course, is the family and the kind of, if a person is brought up in a family with no religion but still very strong moral values, which is very loving family, of course, that's going to that's the most essential thing, of course, if they're if they're brought up in love with strong moral values. But I think that people's lives are for that degree impoverished. And of course, people are growing up now. I mean, it's third and fourth generation of people have been really growing up without any really serious religious formation and nurture in their families. I mean, I lived through the 1960s. In the 1960s, everything really did change. It really did change in the 1960s. Everything was kind of thrown away. And I think, as I say, it's now the third or fourth, probably the fourth generation of people who've not really had that kind of enrichment.
As we close out this interview, as someone who has seen particularly the Anglican Church in so many ways over so many decades, and lived through the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s as well, still, in a sense, dealing with issues today that are threatening to split it. I suppose it's always been a somewhat of a fragile communion anyway. Do you feel confident for the future, or do you fear for the future in terms of where the church is going, in specifically in the UK, I suppose, but also globally?
Well, I suppose, I mean, I don't want to sound pious, I'm not a kind of pious person, but, do try to leave that to God. I mean, if we have to face facts, congregations are predominantly elderly, and there are not a lot of young people. There are a fair number of very young children being brought up in church, but the sort of teenagers and young people, in their 20s and 30s, are not. There is
a generation gap.
There is a huge kind of generation gap there, and the best churches are facing it and doing something about it. And of course, the best churches in facing it are, of course, are the evangelical churches. I'm not insert myself an evangelical, but I think, I think the evangelical tradition in the church saw what was happening long before other people woke up to it, and the Catholic tradition got split and decimated over the ordination of women, between traditional Catholics opposed to the ordination of women, and liberal Catholics, myself, were always very strongly in favour of the ordination of women, and so the Catholic movement within Church of England, which was the dominant tradition really until the 1960s, dominated its leadership, its ethos, its cult, and was hugely successful in certain kind of areas. It just went fut. And we now have a very different kind of kind of ethos in the Church of England, and as I say, evangelical church is not the only churches trying to relate to young people, but they are by the far the best of it,
yes,
obviously.
They're the most successful in that sense. But whether it be evangelical, Anglo-Catholic or whatever, I don't know, does God, as far as you're concerned, still have plans for Anglicanism in the UK?
Well, I haven't asked him, because that's not the kind of question I ask. I leave the church to God and other people. My concern is between the Christian faith and wider culture in which we live: art, literature, politics, ethics. That's where I am on the borderlands. I've always happily left. I'd try to be a faithful churchman, to do my job do my duty as a faithful churchman, but I'm happy to leave the Church of England to God and other people.
It's lovely to have been able to chat to you on the profile
and
today.
You, Justin,
thank you very much.
And to you.
You can find out more about Richard Harries by reading the latest book, The Beauty and the Horror, Searching for God in a Suffering World, published by SBCK, available now in paperback. And do make sure to tune in again at the same time next week for more interviews with Christians in all walks of life. And you can find today's programme as a podcast. If you go and search for it, you're looking for The Profile, or find it from our website, premierchristianradio.com/The Profile. Brought to you in association, as ever, with Premier Christianity magazine. For more on them and the free sample copy of the mag, do go to their website, premierchristianity.com/free sample. Thanks for being with me this week. Coming up next, Premier Playback.